Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, distinguished delegates. The fifth plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination is called to order. The conference will now continue its consideration of Topic 1, Principles and Objectives and Preambular Elements, under Sub-Item B of Agenda Item 8. I call now on the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, everyone. For us, the preamble should explain the foundations and raison d'etre of the instrument and the intentions of state parties. Therefore, it deserves our particular attention. It must be focused, clear, concise, and precise. We share many of the views expressed yesterday by delegations. At the same time, we want to place further emphasis on some elements that need to be included in the preamble. They are as follows: expressing concern about the grave threat to the survival of humanity posed by the existence of nuclear weapons and by their threat or use. Expressing concern also about the lack of political will by the nuclear weapon states that resulted in the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament and prevented commencing multilateral negotiations on nuclear disarmament in the CD. Acknowledging the catastrophic humanitarian consequences and risks associated with a nuclear weapon detonation. Expressing conviction that the continued existence of nuclear weapons undermines the maintenance of international peace and security as the basic purposes of the United Nations. Reaffirming that any use of nuclear weapons would be a violation of the Charter of the United Nations and a crime against humanity as successively declared in the UNGA resolutions since 1961. Underlining the necessity and urgency of developing a comprehensive convention prohibiting the development, production, stockpiling, and trade or use of nuclear weapons, and providing for their total elimination in a time-bound manner and based on international verification mechanism. Recalling the obligations of NPT state parties under its Article 6 to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament and expressing their determination to act accordingly. Underlining the importance of the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, in which the court unanimously concluded that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. Reaffirming that any use of nuclear weapons is contrary to the very principles of international law, in particular international humanitarian law under all circumstances. Stressing that the only absolute and effective guarantee against the use of nuclear weapons is their complete elimination. rejecting categorically such concepts as nuclear deterrence and all national or alliance nuclear postures and strategies authorizing the use of nuclear weapons. Recalling the long-standing international demand by the world political and religious leaders, academia, parliamentarians, and civil society for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And finally, Madam President, underlining the contribution of the treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones to the objective of a world without nuclear weapons, and the need for the establishment of such zones in volatile regions such as the Middle East. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al
I thank the distinguished representative of Iran for his statement. I call now on the representative of the International Red Cross Committee.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, delegates. The International Committee of the Red Cross has long called for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. The ICRC first appealed for the elimination of nuclear weapons in 1945 and has repeated this call ever since. In 2011, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, of which the ICRC is a part, appealed to all states to pursue in good faith and conclude with urgency and determination negotiations to prohibit the use of and completely eliminate nuclear weapons through a legally binding international agreement based on existing commitments and international obligations. The ICRC welcomes that such negotiations are now taking place through an inclusive process in the framework of the UN General Assembly. In this session, the ICRC would like to offer its views on the key elements of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that relate to its underlying principles and to its object and purpose. We offer these views for states to consider as they develop their views and proposals on the treaty's core components. The underlying principles and the object and purpose of a treaty identify the factors that have motivated states to negotiate the instrument and that aid in the subsequent interpretation of the treaty and its provisions. The ICRC believes that the underlying principles of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons should include the following: an expression of deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and the lack of adequate humanitarian response capacity to assist the victims of nuclear weapons. It should equally incorporate a recognition that it is difficult to envisage how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with the principles and rules of international humanitarian law. In particular, the rule of distinction, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the rules on proportionality and precautions in attack, the prohibition on the use of weapons of a nature to cause unnecessary suffering, and the rules that exist for the protection of the environment. The treaty should also include a recognition of the harm suffered by people and communities from nuclear detonations, and that in many instances their needs have not been adequately addressed. It should also include a deep concern about the growing risks of intentional, miscalculated, or accidental use of nuclear weapons and the imperative to prevent such use. The treaty must also include a recognition that nuclear weapons are abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience, and express a determination to advance towards, for states to advance towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. These principles have, under different formulations, been raised in earlier UN resolutions and reports, as well as Resolution 1 of the 2011 Council of Delegates of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement. These principles impel the sense of urgency and necessity for action to advance nuclear disarmament and the development of a prohibition treaty. The treaty should also reinforce the fact that it is part of the broader efforts to advance nuclear disarmament and the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction, a goal set out, as we've heard, in the very first resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly over 70 years ago. In this regard, it should reaffirm the importance of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and recall the commitments of Article 6 of that treaty and the action plans adopted by NPT states parties. It should also reaffirm the importance and role of the treaties creating nuclear weapon-free zones. The treaty should also set out its object and purpose. In the view of the ICRC, the object and purpose of a global prohibition on nuclear weapons include to protect humanity from the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that any use of nuclear weapons would have, to establish a prohibition at the global level, to advance towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and to help bring the area of nuclear weapons to an end once and for all time. The principles set out in this statement can be readily included in the preamble of the treaty. Its object and purpose could be part of the preamble, or they could be articulated in a specific article dedicated to that purpose. Wherever they are placed, the object and purpose, as well as the principles, represent key components of the treaty that will give it a strong foundation and influence its future application and interpretation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al distinguido.
Thank you very much to the representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have heard the last speaker in the list on this item for this meeting. So in accordance with the decision taken in February, we will now hear statements from civil society. I call on Ms. Lynette Ngayu of the African Council of Religious Leaders.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, delegates. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, wishes to make the following recommendations to the preamble. First and foremost, it must convey our deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and our determination, for the sake of all humankind, to eliminate these abhorrent, earth-destroying weapons forevermore. It should stress the need to ensure the full realization of the rights of all victims of nuclear weapons, bearing in mind the sanctity and equity of all human life. We acknowledge the disproportionate and ongoing impact of the use, testing, and development of nuclear weapons on women and girls and indigenous communities around the world. It should underscore the need to rehabilitate, to the greatest extent possible, environments affected by nuclear weapons. The relationship between humanity and the environment is essential and interconnected for the sustenance of our common home. It should emphasize that in a world where basic human needs have not yet been met, the vast resources allocated to the production, modernization, and maintenance of nuclear arsenals must be redirected towards human development and viable societies. It should highlight the role of public conscience in furthering the principles of humanity, as evidenced by the global call of ICAN, the Red Cross, and the world's faith communities for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It should welcome the broad support for the international norms prohibiting other indiscriminate weapons, including biological and toxin weapons, chemical weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. It should reaffirm the applicability of international humanitarian law to the use of nuclear weapons. Finally, it should reaffirm that there exists an obligation under international law to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to the total eliminations of nuclear weapons. In short, the preamble must convey our firm belief that these are wholly unacceptable and unethical weapons, given their indiscriminate nature, their inherent immorality, and their potential to cause indiscriminate harm and annihilate humanity and the planet as a whole. Thank you for your attention.
Le agradezco.
I would like to thank Ms. Gallo for that statement. I call now on Mr. Tilman Roof, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Thank you, Madam President. These negotiations grew out of the humanitarian initiative advanced by ICRC President Kellenberger's call in 2010 to the Geneva Diplomatic Corps and the subsequent recognition of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons in the consensus outcome document of the 2010 NPT Review Conference. We've been delighted to hear so many interventions refer to the substantive conclusions of the landmark evidence-based humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons conferences in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna. The basis for these negotiations is the utterly catastrophic devastation that would inevitably be caused by any use of nuclear weapons, and while they exist, the alarming and growing daily risk of their use. We think this should be prominent in the treaty preamble. An understanding of what nuclear weapons do invalidates all arguments for continuing possession of these weapons and requires that they urgently be prohibited and eliminated as the only course of action commensurate with the existential danger they pose. The world's largest federations of doctors, nurses, and public health professionals are united in this assessment, circulated as a joint working paper to this conference. We believe that the survivors of nuclear weapon impacts, civil society and international experts and organisations should participate in every forum discussing nuclear weapons before and after the conclusion of a banned treaty. We greatly welcome the productive collaborative partnerships with governments in this conference. We commend reference to human rights in the preamble. While human rights are usually considered as non-hierarchical and indivisible, the right to life is a precondition for the enjoyment of all other rights. We commend recognition of our collective responsibility to protect the life and health of future generations in a healthy biosphere and protecting the most vulnerable, particularly women and girls and children who are at greatest risk of harm from exposure to ionising radiation. The imperative of nuclear eradication to secure planetary health is not optional or negotiable. It is the precondition for the survival and continuation of human civilization and life on Earth. Finally, we urge that the treaty be fully comprehensive in its prohibitions. We may not have a second chance. I thank you.
Le agradezco al señor.
I'd like to thank Mr. Tilman Ruff of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War for his statement. And I call now on Ms. Jacqueline Cabasso of the Western States Legal Foundation.
I appreciate the opportunity to make a few comments on preambular elements of a prohibition treaty. I will draw upon the discussion paper submitted and circulated by the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, or IALANA. It makes detailed arguments in support of the 3 points I will make today, and also comments on other topics you will be addressing this week. I commend the paper to your attention. First, it is imperative that the preamble include an affirmation of the illegality of use of nuclear weapons under existing law. This is essential because the core operative prohibitions will apply only to states parties. Any implication that non-states parties are not subject to a prohibition of use must be avoided. A preambular affirmation of the illegality of use would also reinforce the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. The norm of non-use arises out of a broad recognition that the use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with international humanitarian law and the practice of non-use of the weapons in war since 1945. Second, the preamble should include an affirmation of the illegality of the threat of use of nuclear weapons under the UN Charter and international humanitarian law. This would help undermine nuclear deterrence, as well as specific threats that could lead to actual employment of nuclear weapons. Delegitimizing nuclear deterrence is essential to achieving the abolition of nuclear weapons. So long as nuclear deterrence is tolerated, good faith negotiation of nuclear abolition is impossible, resulting in the permanent violation of the disarmament obligation. Third, as stated in the resolution deciding to convene this conference to negotiate a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons leading toward their total elimination, the preamble should recognize that additional measures for the irreversible and verified destruction of nuclear weapons will be needed in order to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. In particular, it should describe the Prohibition Treaty as a step toward a comprehensive agreement on nuclear disarmament, a nuclear weapons convention. Let me remind you that a model convention drafted by IALANA and colleague organizations is already a UN document. Thank you for your attention.
Le agradezco la...
I thank Ms. Jacqueline Cabasso of Western States Legal Foundation for her statement. I now call on Ms. Jean-Marie Colleen and Mr. Kasoshi, Member of Parliament, representing Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Our network for non-proliferation and disarmament is a global one involving more than 700 parliamentarians in many countries. We work with 3 states that are absent today, France, Belgium, and Monaco. We are involved in forums to support nuclear disarmament. The resolution for a resolution prohibiting nuclear weapons. We, in the European parliamentary context, welcome the 3 conferences that were held and ask all members of parliament to foster disarmament, as this is an absolute priority. As regards, we adopted by consensus a resolution in 2016. This shows parliamentarians' commitment towards nuclear disarmament and nuclear dissuasion, and towards a treaty for nuclear disarmament. I am now giving the floor to a Japanese member of parliament to give their view.
A member of parliament from Japan, chair of the Japanese Communist Party, and a member of PNLD. It is regrettable that the Japanese government is absent from this hall, but Hibakusha and the majority of Japanese people strongly support this conference. Regarding negotiation for ban treaty, the participation of nuclear-reliant states would be preferable. However, even if they don't join the process to begin with, a ban treaty concluded by the overwhelming majority of nations could codify the illegality of nuclear weapons threat and use and further stigmatize their position. The resulting Bond Treaty, combined with global action by civil society organizations, will encourage nuclear-reliant states to change their policies and to participate in the process leading to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. I emphasize my strong hope that this conference will be a great success. The Hibakusha deserve no less. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a los señores Jan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colin and Mr. Katsuoshi, members of Parliament. Speaking on behalf of parliamentarians for non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament.
Se agota. Le doy la palabra al
I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I take the floor here at this important conference on negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. I am here as a permanent representative of Central Africa, the Equatorial Guinea, which believes firmly in peace, security, and peaceful coexistence of peoples towards their sustainable development. Today, distinguished delegates, humanity faces many challenges: terrorism, the negative impacts of climate change, armed conflict, pandemics, organized crime. All of this causes loss in human lives. Today, when one travels, when they travel and sit down on a beach or elsewhere while traveling, they're not sure whether they might be able to go home. When we look at all of these challenges, we understand that tackling nuclear weapons is important indeed, as these have a constant threat to humanity. Rather than create peace, they only foster fear among nations. This is an instrument of mass terror without any legitimate strategy or military purpose. They are useless in the face of the threats of today: terrorism, climate change, extreme poverty, and pandemics. More than 40,000 nuclear weapons have been dismantled since the Cold War. And we hear the same justifications today for keeping this, and that is nuclear dissuasion is the argument set forward, when we know that nuclear weapons only cause global insecurity, and they are the most inhumane and indiscriminate weapons ever made. Madam Chair, accordingly, this conference for negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons provides all of us, all of humanity and our planet, with a unique and vital opportunity to lead towards the total elimination of these weapons. This conference is an opportunity to build on the momentum without undermining the framework or method that has been selected. Clearly, Madam President, the theme on the legal prohibition what we need to look at now are the provisions for this instrument. with a view to prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons. I appeal to all United Nations members so that we may all together roll up our sleeves in these negotiations, sparing no effort and being realistic so that once and for all we can have a world free of nuclear weapons for the good of peace and security of all, concluding a legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al distinguido representante.
I thank the permanent representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement.
Ahora sí, concluimos.
We have now completed our consideration of Topic 1, Principles and Objectives, Preambular Elements. Under Subitem B of Agenda Item 8, General Exchange of Views on all matters. The conference will now take up Topic 2, Core Prohibitions, Effective Legal Measures, Legal Provisions, and Norms. This is under Subitem B of Agenda Item 8, entitled General Exchange of Views on All Matters. I will begin by giving the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The matter we are considering today is prohibitions, that is, effective legal measures and other legal provisions and norms which could be included in a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. My delegation believes that the focus of the prohibitions should be the threat or use of nuclear weapons. As we said in our statement yesterday, we have to set forth a clear norm which covers coherently and explicitly the customary norms which constitute the very foundation of the current illegality of nuclear weapons. From our standpoint, this should help to strengthen the structure of international security, disarmament, and nuclear non-proliferation, which already exists. The concept of the threat of use or use of nuclear weapons must be the very focus of the prohibitions in the new legally binding instrument. For the threat of use is the very foundation of nuclear deterrence, which has allowed for the existence and the continuation of this kind of weapon. So the prohibition must serve to weaken the political and conceptual idea of nuclear deterrence. A first step, which is the main step forward in the battle to delegitimize nuclear weapons, means that we must weaken the doctrine which has allowed for the continuation of these weapons and their continuing threat to the security and survival of humanity. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, Article 2.4, which calls on members to refrain from the threat or use of force in international relations, and in accordance with international humanitarian law, which was further strengthened by the 1992 advisory opinion handed down by the International Court of Justice, we must produce a very clear norm which prohibits the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Of course, this central prohibition must be accompanied by other norms. For example, there must also be the prohibition on the design, development, testing, production, acquisition, placing, stockpiling, maintenance, stationing, retention, or transfer of nuclear weapons. These prohibitions should be seen as complementing existing norms. For example, Article 2 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other international regimes, and they would broaden obligations relating to transfer and possession, covering all possible varieties thereof. And this should also help to strengthen the non-proliferation regime so as to avoid vertical proliferation through the modernization of nuclear weapons by using computer-generated simulations or other technologies. Another element we should include in the instrument, and which we must include, relates to the rights of victims to compensation and assistance. Humanitarian consequences were the inspiration for this entire process, and they have made us particularly aware of the devastating impact of any nuclear detonation and its indiscriminate effects for people. And so this is an element which we must not overlook. Thank you very much, Madam.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now call on the representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Before taking up the matter before us, I would like to extend my thanks to all delegations that participated in the preceding segment for the contributions that they made to elaborating the preamble. They made specific proposals which were extremely constructive. And I believe that there was quite a high level of agreement among them, which will help us in elaborating the first draft of the treaty. On the matter now before us, Madam President, I would like to say that in general terms, Mexico would be in favor of elaborating broad prohibitions so as to avoid in future difficult negotiations on too many specific matters which could lead to indefinite postponement of general agreement on the draft of the binding instrument. And so we believe the main general prohibitions which should be considered for inclusion are as follows: prohibition on possessing nuclear weapons, prohibition on acquiring nuclear weapons, prohibition on stockpiling nuclear weapons, prohibition on any use at any time under any circumstances, prohibition on the development of nuclear weapons, prohibition on transfer, prohibition on stationing and deployment of nuclear weapons, prohibition of any kind of assistance to activities prohibited under the treaty, and prohibition on encouraging or inciting or inducing in any way whatsoever anyone to participate in any activity prohibited under the treaty. I'd like to explain my delegation's position on other prohibitions which I have not explicitly mentioned here. We acknowledge that there are additional prohibitions that might be relevant, but they have already been codified in other regimes. This is the case, for example, of the prohibition on the threat to use nuclear weapons. This is covered in Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations, which sets forth a categorical and irrefutable norm. we would urge everybody to think about whether it would be necessary to repeat that as such here, not just as a reconfirmation in the preamble. We feel that this could lead to questioning the integrity and the scope of a norm which has already been codified in the Charter of the United Nations. Also, we believe we should be rather cautious in considering whether to include in the treaty prohibitions or rights which are already covered in other legal instruments which already exist or which are being elaborated now. For example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the NPT itself. And when I talked about treaties being elaborated, there's the one being elaborated on fissile materials. In addition, we would appeal to everyone to avoid the temptation of trying to correct errors or omissions in existing instruments. And with all due respect, we would stress the importance of focusing on obligations which can be implemented, not just ones that we would like to see, but ones that can in fact be implemented. The others can go in the preamble as aspirations or principles which we all agree with. Oh, Madam, we will include these proposals in the paper we will submit by the end of the week. Thank you very much, Madam.
Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. And thank you for this proposal for a document that you will submit by the end of the week. I now give the floor to Sweden.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. The issue of the scope of the treaty, that is, what will be prohibited, is a challenging one that demands careful consideration. For our part, we have come to the conclusion that we would like to see a treaty of a reasonable scope. We should not, at this stage, put too many new obligations on non-nuclear weapon states. As non-nuclear weapon states, we have already committed to forego nuclear weapons through the NPT and fulfilled our obligations in that treaty. Our preliminary view is that the prohibition of nuclear weapons should include possession, use, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and deployment. Like the delegation of Mexico that was just expressed by the ambassador of Mexico, the threat of use is already covered in the United Nations Charter. If development of nuclear weapons is to be included in the treaty, it must be made crystal clear that the rights of states to develop, research, produce, and use nuclear energy in accordance with the NPT and other relevant international agreements will not be affected. Furthermore, the treaty must not have an adverse impact on industry, energy extraction, finance, as well as defense and security cooperation with states that will not become parties to the treaty. If the treaty is to be credible and compatible with other international treaties, it should contain provisions on verification. A comprehensive verification mechanism is, however, not necessary as long as the states possessing nuclear weapons are not party to the treaty. A credible and sufficient verification mechanism would be if all parties to the treaty were required to enter into legally binding commitments with the IAEA based on the model protocol provided in the INFCIRC/540, the so-called additional protocol. That would also be a cost-effective and non-duplicating form of verification. It would also establish a clear link to the NPT. The parties to the treaty should also have an obligation to report with a regular interval to future meetings of state parties or review conferences. To ensure common understanding on what is to be prohibited, it would be desirable for the treaty to contain a definition of nuclear weapons. The treaty should contain a chapter or a protocol envisaging the future participation of nuclear weapon states. It should be indicated that certain obligations then would occur immediately, while others for pure physical reasons would take longer. It should also be indicated that the verification system then would have to be comprehensive and designed in a manner that make the nuclear weapon states trust each other's commitment. But of course, the non-nuclear weapon states must also be included in that design process. When the nuclear weapon states become parties, the obligations of the non-nuclear weapon states would probably also have to be more comprehensive. We could also foresee provisions on assistance to future victims of nuclear detonations. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden for her statement, and now give the floor to the delegation of Sri Lanka.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Madam President. During the exchange of views on the principles and objectives of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, my delegation stressed the importance of premising such an instrument on the notion of illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstances. Building on that stance, we wish to share some of our thoughts on the core prohibitions that the instrument should seek to establish and effective legal measures that could be utilized towards that end, basing ourselves on such norms and principles. Madam President, as we have pointed out earlier, nuclear weapons violate the fundamental principles of international law and constitutes the very negation of the humanitarian concerns which underlie the structure of international humanitarian law. We believe that a legally binding instrument that prohibits nuclear weapons has the transformative power to codify their illegality. Such an instrument would stigmatize the possession of nuclear weapons and ultimately lead towards their total elimination. Such an instrument would also place nuclear weapons on par with other prohibited weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical weapons and biological weapons. In the same manner that the existing legal instruments like the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibit biological weapons and chemical weapons, the instrument that we are discussing should seek the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Madam President, while the instrument could substantially draw from precedent conventions, it should primarily be built on the cardinal obligation emanating from Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which provides for a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. This is the core provision on which the new instrument should be carefully developed. We are also of the view that in keeping with the existing international legal instruments dealing with weapons of mass destruction, the instrument should also reaffirm the rights of people who have become the victims of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon testing. This is a fundamental humanitarian obligation. Madam President, following are some of the core prohibitions that the instrument should seek to establish. It is imperative that the legally binding instruments seek to prohibit states, their nationals, and any other individuals coming under their jurisdiction from engaging in activities related to nuclear weapons. This is particularly important in a context where the danger of nuclear material falling into the hands of non-state actors, specifically terrorists. Prohibited activities must include possession, development, production, testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, deployment, and use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Given the indiscriminate and inhumane nature of nuclear weapons, it is important that the entire cycle of their development to use or the threat of use be covered by prohibitions imposed by the instrument. Further, it would be essential that the treaty banning nuclear weapons also prevent states and entities under their jurisdiction from assisting, financing, investing in, or encouraging any activities related to nuclear weapons. Madam President, we believe that the instrument must create an obligation for state parties to move towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It is imperative that the treaty creates a framework to achieve the objective of ultimate goal of general and complete disarmament. Timelines for the implementation of the treaty, for example, timeline for destruction of stockpiles, may also be built into it for the states parties to comply with. The instrument must create additional obligations for states parties, such as ensuring the rights of the victims and survivors of nuclear weapon-related activities, such as detonation or testing. It must also contain provision to address the issues relating to the damages caused by nuclear weapon activities to the environment. It may be noted in this regard that Article 2 of the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism makes causing substantial damage to property or to the environment by nuclear material an offense. The proposed convention must draw from such existing treaty provisions. In our quest to totally eliminate nuclear weapons, international cooperation, both in terms of finances and technical aspects, plays a pivotal role. Therefore, we strongly believe that the treaty must provide for international cooperation and assistance so that state parties could find recourse to them to meet the obligations arising from the treaty. These are some of our thoughts on the core prohibitions and the legal measures that the instrument should seek to impose. We look forward to hearing the views expressed by member states with much interest. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka, Ambassador Pereira, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Nuclear history may be read as a political struggle over nuclear disarmament. For almost 70 years, since the very first United Nations General Assembly resolution, disarmament measures have been discussed back and forth, often in great detail. The very limited success regarding nuclear disarmament is related to the role played by nuclear weapons in military doctrines. The Cold War, which began almost the same time as the nuclear age, left long-standing legacies that continue to influence nuclear weapon policies. These include the continuation of threat-based policies, nuclear deterrence doctrines, extended deterrence, and policies of first use. In the post-bipolar order, when the ideological confrontation disappeared and the enmity between superpowers fizzled out, strong nuclear postures outlived the absence of threats that would arguably justify their maintenance. Today, those postures are by and large predicated upon the need to defend against the unknown. Madam President, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a framework for disarmament. It was conceived as part of a dynamic bargain to be implemented over time, which would erase in due course the distinction between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. The obligation to disarm is inscribed in Article 6. To that end, it calls for the cooperation of all states to take effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. The NPT parties' compliance to non-proliferation commitments are verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency. There is, however, no mechanism to verify states' compliance with nuclear disarmament. This imbalance is compounded by the paucity of provisions in the NPT on how to attain nuclear disarmament. Article 6 is a legal obligation, crafted, however, in general terms. The fact that no timeline was given for the cessation of the arm race at an early date leaves us with a mounting sense of urgency for action. Madam President, outside the NPT multilateral framework, there has been, since the height of the Cold War, a series of unilateral decisions or bilateral arms control agreements between nuclear weapon states, which had an effect on nuclear disarmament in terms of reduction of nuclear arsenals, confidence building, and risk reduction measures. It is worth noting that most of those initiatives made no mention of the NPT at all, despite the fact that its Article 6 made elimination of nuclear weapons an international legal obligation. This confers credence to the view that for the majority of nuclear powers, the NPT was somewhat marginal to their core security concerns. Within the NPT framework, the prevailing logic so far to attain nuclear disarmament has been the so-called progressive, gradual, or step-by-step approach. This would encompass firstly the cessation of nuclear tests, then a regulation of fissile material for military purposes, and finally a convention on nuclear disarmament. NPT outcome documents from 1995, 2000, and 2010 have endorsed those steps, but none of them have been satisfactorily implemented. Moreover, measures taken by some nuclear-armed states have actually resulted in steps backwards. Madam President, Brazil is of the view that requiring agreement on the step-by-step approach before anything can get started might be precisely what has caused a more than 2-decade-long deadlock regarding the nuclear disarmament agenda. Against this backdrop, a nuclear weapon prohibition can play the role of a catalyst in favor of a new momentum. Besides filling the legal gap concerning the weapons of mass destruction, the prohibition will certainly add pressure for nuclear weapon states' compliance with Article 6. It would do so basically by stigmatizing nuclear weapons, delegitimizing nuclear deterrence, and reaffirming the humanitarian narrative against the existence of this kind of weaponry. Brazil considers that a prohibition should comprise a core set of prohibitions and obligations to be applied to all states without discrimination. The main elements of the prohibition should refer to the use, deployment, possession, stockpiling, transfer or reception, production and development of nuclear weapons, and also to assistance in any form provided to other states seeking to do so. The prohibition to develop nuclear weapons should also unambiguously include tests in all their forms, including subcritical experiments and computational simulations. The stationing in a party's territory of nuclear weapons under the ownership and control of other states should also be proscribed, as it is incompatible with the prohibition of possession and stockpiling. Madam President, prohibition comes often before elimination. A telling example of this reasoning is the chemical weapons process. In the 1925 Geneva Protocol set out the prohibition of those weapons, whereas the Chemical Weapons Convention adopted in 1993 established verification and elimination mechanisms. Those who advocate the prohibition of nuclear weapons only as the final installment of nuclear disarmament process might be underestimating the influence of norms on international politics. Norms reflect desirable patterns of behavior. They also express values held dear by the international community. Once those norms become part of customary international law, pressure will be generated on actors that deviate from the established pattern. Brazil is convinced that the norm setting out a prohibition of nuclear weapons will be an effective step towards nuclear disarmament. Those who claim it will be ineffective because it will not provide for the immediate dismantling of nuclear weapons abide by a narrow, perhaps self-serving logic in favor of the status quo. Just as with climate change, every action we take today will have consequences tomorrow, if not in the short term, then in the medium or long term. The same is valid for nuclear disarmament. To give up prohibiting nuclear weapons on grounds that elimination of existing nuclear arms will not begin straight away is nonsensical and a gross miscalculation of the steady incremental influence of norms. Madam President, for too long we have allowed the nuclear weapon states alone to set the pace of the nuclear disarmament agenda. The threat to life on the planet represented by the mere existence of nuclear weapons is a matter pertaining to all states. It is our duty to consider alternatives to the status quo. The prohibition of nuclear weapons is a window of opportunity to rekindle nuclear disarmament negotiations. Let's seize it in a responsible, constructive, and resolute way. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of Brazil for that statement. Ambassador Patriota, thank you. I call now on the representative of Algeria.
Thank you very much, Madam, for giving me the floor. Madam Chair, given the importance of this thematic debate related to core prohibition that the legal binding treaty on nuclear weapons should contain effective legal measures, legal provisions and norms, Algeria would like to seize this opportunity to express the following general comments on this topic. My delegation would like to emphasize that the treaty's prohibition have to put the nuclear weapons on the same footing as biological and chemical weapons, of which these weapons of mass destruction are subjected to prohibition through their own and specific treaties. My delegation believes that a legally binding international instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons should be as a partial step towards nuclear disarmament and contribute to codify ways and means that would put a definitive end to these evil weapons and to stigmatize them. The treaty's effective measures of prohibitions of nuclear weapons need to be crafted and to be built upon existing regime, and their sole purpose is to enforce existing legal instruments, especially obligations under Article 6 of the NPT. Unlike other international legal instruments that deal with inherently indiscriminate weapons, this treaty has also to reaffirm the rights of people who have been victimized by nuclear weapons. Therefore, Madam Chair, my delegation would like to see that the treaty should reflect inter alia the following core prohibitions: the acquisition, possession, maintaining, retain, stockpiling, development, transfer, testing, production. Secondly, participating in any use of nuclear weapons, including through participating both in nuclear war planning and in the targeting of nuclear weapons, and training personnel to take control of nuclear weapons. Permitting nuclear weapons from entering in, being transiting through, stationing or deploying on national territory, including on territorial seas, airspace, and land. Fourth, any nuclear activity for military purposes in outer space. Fifth, assisting, encouraging, or inducing directly or indirectly any activity prohibited by the treaty. Furthermore, and most important, my delegation would like to see that the treaty should also contain robust measures regarding the recognition of the rights and the needs of victims and survivors of the use and testing of nuclear weapons, including with regard transgenerational health effects, and a commitment to provide assistance to those victims and to environmental remediation. In addition to that, my delegation concurs with the majority of the states that the treaty should include as well issues related to dual-use technology without prejudice to the inalienable rights of all states to peaceful use of nuclear energy. Finally, the treaty should contain a strong verification system inspired from the International Atomic Energy Agency and CTBTO. In light of the above, my delegation hopes that these core prohibitions elements will be duly reflected in the operative part of this treaty. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria for the statement, and I call now on the representative of the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. Our discussion on this topic represents the heart of the work that we have embarked on this week. This section in the proposed legal instrument will form the bedrock of this international effort, as it will aim to establish obligations and norms that will proscribe nuclear weapons in general and pave the way for their eventual total elimination. In this context, we can focus our efforts to formulate a text that will, in general terms, declare nuclear weapons as illegal. What we need to do now is to establish general interdictions and obligations, pronouncing an unambiguous political commitment to the achievement and maintenance of a world free of nuclear weapons. This approach effectively complements the NPT regime. Towards this end, my delegation believes that the core prohibitions should cover the following: possession, use and threat of use, acquisition, stockpiling, development, testing, transfer, transit, stationing, and deployment of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices. The core prohibitions should also cover assisting, encouraging, or inducing, directly or indirectly, the engagement in any activity prohibited by the legally binding instrument. Madam President, the Philippines stresses that the prohibition should not impinge on states' inalienable right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, which plays a major role in their economic and social development. States parties should therefore undertake to use exclusively for peaceful purposes nuclear material and facilities under international standards of safeguards without discrimination. My delegation would also like to see the inclusion of a provision that aims to lay down, at the appropriate time, a phased program and time frame for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons for states that possess them once they have acceded to the treaty. On the question of verification, any legal instrument that does not provide for a mechanism that ensures that states are abiding by their obligation will be for naught. In this regard, we advocate for the inclusion of a provision that calls for the establishment of a verification system at the appropriate time. That system would ensure the reduction of stockpiles and irreversible dismantling and destruction of nuclear weapons by states that possess them. With these elements, the Philippines believes that the instrument would have political and legal impact to move the disarmament efforts forward, provide the needed direction, and pave the way for further initiatives to finally realize the aspiration of a world free of nuclear weapons. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines for that statement, and I call now on the representative of Austria.
Thank you so much, Madam President. The substantive prohibitions are the core of the future treaty. This is because in referring to and aside a legal instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons, unquote, the UN General Assembly mandated us to negotiate precisely this prohibition. In so doing, we would achieve crucial progress over crucial progress, and we would lay the foundation for future legal instruments dealing with the actual elimination of nuclear weapons and their verification. When looking for possible models for the prohibition clauses of the new treaty, at least two things have to be borne in mind. First, there is a gap, since no treaty comparable to the Biological Weapons Convention or the Chemical Weapons Convention has so far been brought about. So therefore, what we are lacking is a comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons. Partial or limited prohibitions applicable to nuclear weapons do exist, notably most of all in the NPT, but they're only for non-nuclear weapon states, and in other international treaties such as the CTP with regard to testing, and certainly the various treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones. It is important that the new treaty not only underpins and supports these existing norms, but builds upon them. Second, apart from the
Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, the treaties outlawing anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions also provide examples of existing and demonstrably effective international law prohibiting specific, indiscriminate, and inhumane weapons. Looking at these precedents and in line with international practice, Austria suggests the following prohibitions: prohibition of use, prohibition of possession, prohibition of development, prohibition of production, prohibition of acquisition in another way, prohibition of stockpiling, prohibition of transfer, and finally, prohibition of the assistance, encouragement, or inducement to engage in any of the prohibited activities. We are not persuaded of the added value that would result from including a prohibition on testing in this treaty, because this is already contained in the prohibition of development. In addition, most of us have ratified the CTBT. Neither would we see an advantage in including a distinct prohibition on transit. Prohibiting transit would call for negotiations on difficult practical issues, such as the demarcation of maritime and airspace, and virtually it is not possible to check every freight parcel that is transiting, for example, through our airports. In any event, we consider that the granting of transit rights would fall within a prohibition on assistance. The prohibition on assistance would also apply to stationing of foreign nuclear weapons on one's territory. We do not believe that explicitly prohibiting the threat of use, the scope of which is subject to differing interpretation, would be valuable. There is already a general prohibition on the threat of use in the UN Charter. In incorporating a specific prohibition of the threat of use of nuclear weapons, we could be seen as calling into question the validity of that more general norm. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Austria, Ambassador Anoxi. And now I give the floor, perdón, voy a pasar a español. Le doy la palabra.
I call now on Colombia. Thank you very much, Madam President. On the matter before us today, prohibitions to be included in a possible treaty, we believe that the prohibitions should be in accordance with obligations already assumed by states under existing treaties. Specifically, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and in the case of Latin America, the Tlatelolco Treaty. We are fully committed to the NPT and its 3 pillars, which we see as the keystone for any future nuclear disarmament. Accordingly, introducing a regime for prohibiting nuclear weapons leading towards their elimination must complement and strengthen obligations already assumed by states members under the existing non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. It's important we discuss each aspect of the prohibition, bearing in mind that this structure must be in accordance with our long-term goal, namely to achieve and keep a world free from nuclear weapons. We feel the following issues should be discussed: use, threat of use, development and testing, manufacture and production, transfer, transit, installation of bases and deployment, possession and stockpiling, assistance in the commission of prohibited actions, encouragement and inducement, and funding. Thank you, Madam. As has been said by many, a nuclear weapon-free world is a vision shared by a majority of countries and an aspiration of humanity. There is agreement on the goal, but less on how to achieve it. We should remember that nobody has the perfect solution, and we have to have a frank exchange of views. And so, negotiations to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world will have to very carefully consider the elements of the prohibition. And we also have to encourage states that have a different view to come closer to this view. We have little time for negotiating an instrument which will have such an impact on the disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation structure in which all countries are involved. We could recall that the Arms Trade Treaty was discussed for 6 years and negotiated in 2 years. And so we ask whether we are moving ahead fast enough or whether we have enough time. We believe we must not consider prohibitions that go against commitments already made on security, the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and trade in that respect. And lastly, may I mention that this matter is being discussed within the group of governmental experts on this very issue. Whatever progress we made in this negotiation, we have to take account of the others' work and their relationship to our long-term goal of eliminating nuclear weapons. Madam, analysing the 12 issues that I have mentioned can help us move towards our goals of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you, Madam. I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia for his statement. And I call now on the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving me the floor to express Liechtenstein's views on what should be contained in the core prohibitions of the new nuclear weapons ban treaty. In our view, the treaty should have both a normative and practical impact and ultimately lead to increased security for everyone. But the normative prohibition of nuclear weapons is of course the centerpiece of the treaty and needs to be clear and comprehensive in its provisions. While provisions must be clear and comprehensive, they should not undermine the aspiration to universality of the treaty. The prohibitions and obligations should be based on provisions of existing legally binding instruments and should be consistent with the existing nuclear disarmament architecture. With regard to the prohibitions, Liechtenstein calls for prohibitions to apply to states parties, their nationals, and any other individual subject to their jurisdiction. Specifically, the treaty should prohibit the use and threat to use of nuclear weapons, as well as their development, production, acquisition, possession, stockpiling, testing, also financing and brokering, transfer, import, export, as well as encouragement of or incitement to prohibited actions. In addition, a set of positive obligations could also be included in the body of the treaty. As stated before, the treaty should ultimately aspire to universality, so particular consideration should be given to the possible format of engagement with nuclear weapon states and other states currently not participating in this process, and thus to the modalities for these states to adhering to the prohibition regime. Finally, the treaty could contain a commitment to inform and educate the public about the risks of nuclear weapons in order to prevent future generations from repeating the mistakes of the past and safeguarding the nuclear-free world. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein for that statement. I call now on the representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, distinguished delegates, at the outset, my delegation would like to commend the excellent work that you and other members of the Bureau have done so far. After 2 days of deliberation, our important work today is to discuss concrete, effective legal measures to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. In this regard, we wish to highlight the following possible elements that could be included in a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. First, prohibition of development, production, testing, including subcritical and other means of testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transport, deployment, stationing, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The engagement in any activities prohibited. Second, the necessity of additional measures, both practical and legally binding, for the reversible, verifiable, transparent destruction of nuclear weapons. Third, the need to ensure negative security assurances to all non-nuclear weapon states, the rights of victims and survivors of nuclear weapons activities, responsibility to address the damage to affected environment. Finally, the importance of a framework for international cooperation and technical assistance. Madam President, efforts to maintain international peace, security are the responsibility of all states. With that in mind, we'd like to assure you of our full support and participation in the negotiation process. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I call now on the representative of Malaysia.
Madam President, thank you for this opportunity for my delegation to speak on this topic and to share with the conference our contributions on some of the core prohibitions that should be included in the legally binding instrument. As a party to the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, SHONFES, and the NPT, Malaysia has committed itself for the full spectrum of potential prohibitions that could go into a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. For the purpose of the objectives of this conference and to ensure a successful outcome in the second session, we wish to address the following prohibitions that could go into this treaty. Firstly, use and threat of use should be included and would be the main prohibition of the treaty. Prohibiting use would be in line with a number of nuclear weapons free zone treaties, Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT, which implicitly prohibits non-nuclear weapon states from use and create the legal norm that would prohibit use as a whole, thereby closing the gap which the ICJ identified in its 1996 advisory opinion. Additionally, such a prohibition would close the legal gap by creating the first treaty prohibition of nuclear weapons under international law. Secondly, on development, production, and manufacture, these elements could be included in the main section of the treaty if it is understood that it would mean the production of a fully assembled nuclear weapon. If this element were to be included as including parts or components, then it is likely that major technical discussions would be triggered, and it would be difficult for us to come to an agreement, especially as parts and components may be of a dual-use nature. As there is no singular internationally agreed list of dual-use items, and many countries would need to develop an export control mechanism. An understanding of development, production, and manufacture in the context of parts or components would be difficult to enforce. For Malaysia, we would not have a problem with this, as we are committed to it through SHONFAS and NPT Article 1. Nearly all other countries that would be part of the conference would also be bound by the NPT or any of the other nuclear weapon-free zones of which they are a party. Thus, the issue of these elements should be on a fully assembled nuclear weapon, and if not, it would have to be referred to in the preamble. Thirdly, regarding testing, this element could be included in the main section of the treaty, as all nuclear weapon-free zones prohibit testing, and nearly all other countries that would be part of the conference are also party or signatory to the CTBT. A reference of prohibition on testing should be a simple prohibition. If the inclusion of testing as a prohibition would lead to major technical discussions or accusations that it would contradict the CTBT and therefore lead to political divisions in the conference, then the issue can be included in the preambular. Fourthly, on transfer and acquisition, these elements could be included in the main section of the treaty, as all nuclear weapon-free zones prohibit acquisition and control over nuclear weapons. Non-nuclear weapon states are also prohibited from receiving any transfer of nuclear weapons or take control over them. However, a legal gap exists in that some countries are part of nuclear sharing agreements and may acquire control of nuclear weapons stationed on their territory in times of war. Thus, the question on this element as a core prohibition would be on whether including it as a main prohibition would make the instrument less inclusive and close the doors for countries that have nuclear sharing agreements. Fifthly, regarding transit, this element should not be included in the main section of the treaty, and if it were to be included, it should be in the preamble. Controlling transit can be difficult, and thus the inclusion of this element would be practically unfeasible, but also lead to technical discussions that would not contribute to the treaty. Sixth, on stationing and deploying, this element could be included in the main section of the treaty, as all nuclear weapon-free zones prohibit stationing or deploying of nuclear weapons. However, beyond nuclear weapon-free zones, there are no other international prohibitions on stationing or deploying. Thus, the question on this element would be on whether including it as a main prohibition would make the instrument less inclusive and close the doors for countries that have nuclear weapons deployed on their territory. Seventh, on stockpiling and possession, these elements could be included in the main section of the treaty, as all nuclear weapon-free zones prohibit stationing or deploying of nuclear weapons. Moreover, under Article 2 of the NPT, non-nuclear weapon states are essentially prohibited from having nuclear weapons and thus possessing nuclear weapons. A legal gap exists, however, in situations where non-nuclear weapon states have nuclear weapons stockpiled on their territory or would gain control of them in times of war through a nuclear sharing agreement. Thus, the question on this element would be on whether including it as a main prohibition would, again, make the instrument less inclusive and close the doors for countries that have nuclear weapons stockpiled on their territory, and or whether they should or would gain control of such weapons. Eighth, regarding questions on assisting, encouraging, or inducing, directly or indirectly, the engagement in any activity prohibited by the legally binding instrument, the treaty should have a general obligation that state parties do not assist other states with acts prohibited by the treaty. Further detailed prohibitions would not be necessary, as they would trigger major political debates, technical debate, or elimination and verification measures. For example, there may be companies involved in commercial activities that may either directly contribute to the modernization of nuclear arsenals or the development and manufacture of dual-use parts or components that may go into a fully assembled nuclear weapon. Distinguish that is difficult, and trying to control it in the instrument would cast too wide a net that could have effects on adverse impacts on civilian and non-nuclear trade and investments. And last but not least, ninth, on stockpile destruction and storage, these elements need not be included in this instrument as they would refer to the issue of elimination, which is not mandated for the conference. Moreover, ensuring destruction and or storage pending destruction would require commensurate discussions on verification, and this in turn would entail technical discussions beyond the time available in this conference. We wish to restate, as we have in our previous statements, that while being ambitious, we need to be realistic on what we are able to fully consider and achieve in our limited time. We are prepared to fully consider those and engage with delegations to ensure a successful outcome for this conference. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia for her statement, and now call on the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to begin by reiterating our delegation's previous statement in the high-level segment that the legal provisions and norms of the treaty should be firm, strong, and unambiguous. And in this regard, we are of the view that the following elements should be prohibited under the treaty. First is the prohibition of possession of a nuclear weapon. State should be prohibited from possessing nuclear weapons and to decommission existing nuclear weapons and warheads and other related nuclear weapons materials. Second is the prohibition of the use of and threat of use of nuclear weapons. Third is the prohibition on development. In this category, states will be prohibited from developing, testing, including through subcritical experiments and computer simulations, producing, acquiring, and stockpiling and transferring of nuclear weapons. Fourth element is a prohibition on financing. We believe that the treaty should also prohibit states from financing the development, testing, production, and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. And the fifth element is the prohibition on the deployment, transit, visitation of vessels or aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia and call on Guatemala. With regard to theme 2, basic prohibitions, core prohibitions, we'd like to see the following included. As was mentioned, the treaty should recognize, as from experience and norms in other treaties dealing with biological and chemical weapons, total prohibition is needed for elimination. States parties should not develop, produce, test, acquire, store, station, transfer, deploy, or use such weapons in any circumstance, or use or threaten to use these. Nor should there be financing or inducement of prohibited measures. There should be transparent and verifiable measures. It should also prohibit the obligation of eliminating nuclear weapons and a framework to do this. It needs detailed provisions for elimination, but states parties can agree on relevant measures and timeframes as part of the implementation process through protocols or other legal instruments as appropriate. There are other clauses that should be included. These relate to modalities to ensure compliance and implementation and measures in case of non-compliance. There needs to be exchange of information among states parties. We should also clearly distinguish between the UN, the IAEA, and the Treaty on Non-Proliferation. The treaty should include obligations to address environmental damage, in affected sites, provide technical assistance and international assistance to comply with obligations of the instrument. Those are some of our preliminary comments, but we reserve the right to go back and react at other times. Thank you. I thank Guatemala for her statement and call on Cuba.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Thank you, Vice President. This is the first time I take the floor and wish to congratulate you on your election and wish you great success. Cuba believes that an instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons should include the following provisions: categorically prohibit the possession, production, development, testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, deployment, stationing, use, or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Prohibit any activity related to military or other types of preparations for the use of nuclear weapons. Prohibiting research, design, manufacturing for upgrading or modernizing nuclear weapons. Prohibiting nuclear tests, including subcritical testing, or with the use of sophisticated computer methods. Prohibit encouragement or inducement of any activity related to nuclear weapons, including financing. Prohibit the transit of nuclear weapons through airspace and territorial waters of states parties to the instrument, as well as the presence in ports and airfields of vessels or aircraft from abroad that might transport nuclear weapons. In addition, nuclear weapons states should also follow the following provisions: the time-bound destruction of a nuclear arsenal in their ownership or possession, or situated under their jurisdiction or control. Destroy nuclear weapons that have been abandoned in another state's territory. To destroy or reconvert installations for the production and testing of nuclear weapons with a view to the destruction of the weapons. Destroy or reconvert delivery systems of nuclear weapons for non-nuclear uses. Prohibit the production of fissile material for the manufacture of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices, and to eliminate their existence. Security assurances that are universal, unconditional, and legally binding. Assurances that nuclear weapons will not be used. This should also have obligations to ensure implementation of provisions. The future instrument should cover the inalienable right to conduct research, development, and use nuclear energy for peaceful means, and establish provisions in international cooperation and assistance, including assistance to victims. It should also have a mechanism to implement provisions of the instrument, including relating to verification and compliance, as well as a forum for consultation and cooperation among member states. Thank you. Microphone, please.
Perdón. Agradezco al
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba.
to the distinguished delegation of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before addressing the core prohibitions of the new instrument, allow me to make some comments on the scope and nature of the instrument. Various options have been mentioned in terms of the type of instrument that is required, including a treaty, convention, framework agreement, or some form of hybrid between these options. My delegation acknowledges that there are distinct advantages in each of these approaches. As distinct from the Nuclear Weapons Convention, with its merit, South Africa's preference for this negotiation is a prohibition treaty. It seems evident that the type of instrument that we envisage would not include all elements that may be necessary in a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention. For example, there seems to be broad agreement that extensive verification arrangements related to nuclear arms reductions would not be appropriate in the kind of instrument envisaged under the resolution. Furthermore, the concept of a framework agreement also seems more relevant for negotiations in which all states participate, although we recognize that a prohibition treaty could serve as a framework for nuclear disarmament. South Africa supports the conclusion of an effective, comprehensive, non-discriminatory international treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Our support for such an instrument is without prejudice to our continuing support for the commencement of negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament on a treaty banning the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons, as well as a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention. In our view, the process towards the conclusion of an instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons is not intended to compete with these efforts, but rather to complement them. Mr. President, in South Africa's view, an international legally binding prohibition treaty would constitute an important step towards the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Such an instrument should, as a minimum, prohibit the production, use, and threat of use, stockpiling, deployment, transfer, testing, financing, and assistance for nuclear weapons program. While the instrument would clearly be more limited than the Nuclear Weapons Convention, we do not support the idea of turning a simple political declaration into a legally binding instrument. While such an instrument may well be easier to negotiate within the limited time available, it is unlikely to be taken seriously by those who may choose to remain outside, thereby limiting its capacity to stigmatize, devalue, and delegitimize nuclear weapons, which should be our aim. More comprehensive prohibitions would therefore be preferred in the form of an unambiguous treaty text. In addition, Mr. President, for such an instrument to be an effective and credible tool, it would be important to incorporate provisions that would allow states possessing nuclear weapons to join the instrument while they commit to eliminate their nuclear weapons within a specified time frame. This may require some form of verification provision that will enable state parties to obtain assurances that the state has indeed eliminated its nuclear weapons at the end of the time frame specified in the treaty. One option that can be considered is to include a provision dealing with destruction, an initial and final declaration, as well as verification arrangements that would apply to any state possessing nuclear weapons joining the treaty. Mr. President, for this purpose, a state party would be required to submit an initial declaration on its nuclear weapons stockpile earmarked for destruction, upon which it may be granted a maximum period of 10 years from entry into force for that state to finalize its destruction activities, perhaps with a possible extension of another 10 years. Once this process has been completed, such state will submit a final declaration confirming finalization of the process and that all its nuclear material and facilities are under comprehensive IAEA safeguards. This could be verified by the IAEA, confirming that all nuclear material and facilities are under comprehensive IAEA safeguards. Likewise, we recognize that it may be necessary to consider provisions related to the participation of states under the nuclear umbrella. While we will engage constructively in negotiations on proposals in this regard, it is imperative that the letter and spirit of the new instrument is not undermined. Mr. President, in our view, a prohibition treaty should not impose new obligations on state parties that go beyond their obligations under the NPT. It would therefore be necessary to establish a clear link to the rights and obligations of NPT state parties. However, it would also be important to ensure that such elements to be included in the treaty would be non-discriminatory and allow all states, whether they are party to the NPT or not, to join. In addition, nothing in the new instrument should impose any restrictions on the inalienable right of states to nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. The element of possession should, in our view, be the key focus of the new treaty. This means that the development, acquisition, and stockpiling of nuclear weapons need to be prohibited in a non-discriminatory manner. At present, only non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT are not allowed to develop, acquire, or stockpile, and this needs to be extended to all states. A prohibition on the deployment and placement of nuclear weapons in certain geographical areas are already provided for in some of the nuclear weapon free zone treaty agreements, as well as in outer space throughout the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. This now needs to be extended to all areas. The same principles apply to the issue of transfer, transshipment, and transit that should also be subjected to a non-discriminatory prohibition. The testing of nuclear weapons should also be prohibited. The CTBT has not yet entered into force and is incomplete as it only bans nuclear test explosions, thereby excluding other forms of non-explosive testing such as computer simulations. The treaty would have to be clear on other new forms of testing such as subcritical tests. The treaty should contain a clear ban on the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Such a provision would be key to the effort to delegitimate the concept of nuclear deterrence. Mr. President, it is important that a mechanism is established to enable states requiring assistance in national implementation to receive support from state parties that are able to assist. South Africa also supports the establishment of a compliance and dispute resolution mechanism among state parties. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation hopes that our views on the core prohibitions will be favorably considered in the Chair's drafting process. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for her statement.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. Sir, Venezuela is guided by the spirit and letter of the Tlatelolco Treaty, given the vital need to eliminate nuclear weapons irreversibly and verifiably, and also with a view to achieving general and complete disarmament. Accordingly, Venezuela believes that the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons should contain the following elements. These are non-exhaustive. The prohibition of acquiring, possessing, stockpiling, developing, testing, or producing, or threat of use of nuclear weapons in any circumstance. Next, the prohibition from allowing nuclear weapons to be used in the national territory, including to allow vessels with nuclear weapons in ports and territorial waters. Also prohibiting aircraft with nuclear weapons from entering national airspace, or for nuclear weapons to transit through a national territory, or to be stationed or deployed in the national territory. Sir, we have taken note of the comments made by some countries that have spoken earlier. It is not our intention to create additional obligations for those countries, those of us participating here at this conference. The aim is to address all the activities that are linked to those states which harbor nuclear weapons in their territories and depend on these in their doctrines, their security doctrines. If those countries do not abandon this concept of nuclear war, then what hope do we have? Next, we must prohibit participation in nuclear war planning. This includes the establishment of security doctrines that would justify the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and the establishment of nuclear partnerships. In addition, we believe that the treaty must recognize victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons. The new treaty should provide assistance to victims. We recognize the particular responsibility to countries and areas affected in the non-self-governing territories recognized by the United Nations. These territories have been adversely affected as a result of nuclear testing of the past. Mr. President, although our ultimate objective is the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, it is our understanding that the prohibition of these weapons is the step to take immediately preceding that ultimate goal. That is what brings us here today at this conference. Nevertheless, we believe that this treaty must set out a direct link in some way, a direct link to elimination, total and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Agradezco al...
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of Thailand.
Mr. President, yesterday we had fruitful deliberations on the principles and objectives and preambular elements of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. Most delegations which took the floor expressed their views in the same lines as what contains in the report of the Open Ends Working Group, taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. Or the old EWG report adopted in 19 August 2016 in Geneva. Thailand believes that the suggested elements and recommendations contained in the report provide a good basis for our deliberations here at this UN conference. Taking the OEWG report and NPT into consideration and in line with treaties establishing nuclear weapons-free zones, my delegations firmly believe that the essence of effective legal measures of the instrument should include the suggest elements contained in paragraph 35 and 44, as well as Annex 2 of the report. The instrument should unequivocally prohibit all acts relating directly to and associated with nuclear weapons, such as their development, testing, production, acquisition, possession, stockpiling, transfer, use, and threat of use. The instrument should also prohibit the stationing and development of nuclear weapons, as well as financing of nuclear weapon activities and assistance, encouragement, and endowments in prohibited acts. In addition, the instruments should include other elements associated with the elimination of nuclear weapons, including those related to vessels, material verifications, as well as elements linked to other objectives such as victims' assistance. The above acts and elements should constitute the core of the instrument without prejudice to any further deliberations on this matter. Mr. President, now it is time that the international communities must demonstrate its strong support and commitment to the delegitimations, prohibitions, and complete eliminations of nuclear weapons in order to ensure their total destructions. The instrument should also provide mechanisms to encourage the constructive engagement and participation of states that are outside of this instrument with a view of promoting universalization and effective implementations of the instrument. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative from the Kingdom of Thailand. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. For the topic 2, my delegation agrees with those delegations which stand for the complete prohibition of nuclear weapons, including not to conduct research on, develop, manufacture, stockpile, or otherwise acquire, possess, or have control over any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device by any means anywhere. Not to seek or receive any assistance in research on, development, manufacture, stockpiling, acquisition, possession, or obtaining control over any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device. Not to take any action to assist or encourage the conduct of research on, development, manufacture, stockpiling, acquisition, or possession of any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device. Not to allow in its territory, first, the production, acquisition, stationing, storage, or use of any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device. Second, the receipt, storage, stockpiling, installation, or other form of possession of or control over any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device. Third, any actions by anyone to assist or encourage the development, production, stockpiling, acquisition, possession of or control over any nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device. Carry out the transit or transshipment of nuclear weapon, prohibiting the financing of nuclear weapons production. We also offer to include the following norms. Each party should undertake not to allow the disposal of radioactive wastes of other states in its territory. In accordance with the CTBT, each party shall undertake not to carry out any nuclear weapon test explosion and any other nuclear explosion, to prohibit and prevent any such nuclear explosion in any place under its jurisdiction or control, to refrain from including, encouraging, or participating in any test explosion of nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosion. Each party shall undertake to contribute to any efforts on environmental rehabilitation of territories contaminated by past activities associated with the development, production, or storage of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, in particular uranium tailing and nuclear test sites. Nothing in new treaties shall prejudice the rights of parties to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. We also consider it's important to include the ban of the production and stockpiling of fissile materials for the military purposes, since it is fissile materials that are the key element in the production of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative from Kazakhstan. Y ahora doy la palabra.
And I call now on the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ecuador, of course, agrees that the conference should focus on discharging the mandate given it by the General Assembly to negotiate a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. We have been following carefully the proposals and ideas put forward by delegations to date on this central issue of the treaty. We've said from the very beginning, and we said it yesterday and we'll say it today, the treaty must be clear, it must be short, but at the same time it must be precise and not open to any kind of misinterpretation, loophole, gaps, omissions, which would mean that anybody could fail to implement it. And so what we want to propose are the following elements for prohibitions, which we believe should be included in the treaty. Of course, they take into account the right to development and the use of nuclear power for peaceful purposes. The provisions would make it incumbent on states parties to the treaty and their citizens and any other individual under their jurisdiction. So the first prohibition would be to develop, and this would include nuclear testing, and thereby strengthen the provisions in the CTBT. There is nothing to prevent various treaties from strengthening the same obligation in the Latin American and Caribbean states that are already party to the Tlatelolco Treaty. We have signed and ratified and become party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well as non-nuclear states. And both treaties have the same subject. We want to prohibit development, and this must include testing, including subcritical tests, and tests which are contrary to the CTBT. And of course, this prohibition to develop would also include a prohibition on testing nuclear weapons. Secondly, there should be a prohibition on producing nuclear weapons, anything contributing to the manufacture of a nuclear weapon. Third, prohibition on transfer of nuclear weapons. This would mean that you could actively not transfer and passively not accept, under any modality whatsoever, any nuclear weapon. 4, prohibition on transit through the territory, air or sea space of the party. 5, on holding or stockpiling any nuclear weapons under any way, with or without transfer of ownership or control. 6, a prohibition on marketing, and that would also include marketing technology and necessary know-how as to how to produce nuclear weapons. 7, prohibition on transport by state or private methods under the control of the state party. 8, prohibition on stockpiling without importing and 9, a prohibition on the threat or use. This is necessary for nuclear weapons so that it is quite explicit, and this would relate to deterrence. And 10thly, prohibition on the use. It would be quite clear that the use of nuclear weapons is contrary to international humanitarian law, and it is a crime against humanity. And 11, there must be prohibition on for states, parties, and their citizens or natural or juridical persons under their jurisdiction to provide assistance or funding or to encourage or induce the production, any activity which is prohibited under the treaty. And so, Madam, the mandate for the conference says at the end it should lead towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And so somehow the treaty has to include provisions so that we can build the processes for actually eliminating the weapons. Transparency, verification, in addition to the positive obligations being incurred by state parties. So these matters will be taken up by my delegation at a later stage. Right now, we're talking about the prohibitions, and we don't want to go beyond our mandate. But we cannot forget the ultimate goal, which is total, irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much, Madam.
Muchas gracias al distinguido delegado.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador for that contribution. I call now on the representative of Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Today we are looking into elements that must be included in the substantive part of the Treaty on Prohibition. What does it mean to prohibit nuclear weapons? What are the elements of this prohibition? In the general obligations, core obligations of the treaty, these should be in Article 1, and this can follow the model of conventions on biological or chemical weapons. I will try to touch on some of the prohibitions. This is not exhaustive, but practical. We should recall the mandate of Resolution 71/258. This is a treaty about prohibition of nuclear weapons. As was mentioned time and again, this is not an end in itself, but simply a step leading towards elimination of nuclear weapons. Accordingly, we must exercise caution in our proposals and not include aspects that might be counterproductive. First, we should talk about prohibition of the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. It is difficult to think up a scenario where nuclear weapons might be compatible with international humanitarian law. Nuclear weapons have catastrophic effects, and as such do not comply with the principle of distinction, even less so the principle of proportionality. These weapons have a humanitarian impact that will always be greater than the military advantage they might provide to those using them. The threat of use of these is also an affront to peace and international security, as the Security Council itself stated in Resolution 984. Just as important as the prohibition on the use is the prohibition relating to development and production of these weapons. This provision could include preliminary steps, including research, but should not interfere with the peaceful use of nuclear energy. For those of us who are states parties to the Tlatelolco Treaty, that is complementary to provisions from this treaty and would add added value. A state can possess nuclear weapons because it has developed and manufactured these, but also because it has acquired these weapons. Accordingly, the acquisition as well as the transfer of nuclear weapons should be included in the text. Another prohibition to be included relates to stockpiling and possession. At the end of the day, if we include these provisions in the treaty, we could do the same for a nuclear disarmament instrument. No state acceding to the treaty can possess nuclear weapons. Any state which possesses nuclear weapons should eliminate them. A state that has nuclear weapons, if it has decided to eliminate these, can then negotiate a protocol with states parties to this treaty following a specific roadmap. Likewise, this instrument complements the NPT and nuclear weapons-free zones and should complement the CTBT. As we know, the CTBT has not yet entered into force. Moreover, the CTBT only prohibits explosive testing, and so we should prohibit all other types of testing, as well including the form of testing through computers or subcritical testing. Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica, Ambassador Mendoza, and I was consulted with regard to the list of speakers on theme 2. That list remains open. Any delegation that is not yet on the list can request to be placed on the list. I give the floor now to Peru.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for giving me the floor. Madam President, it is imperative that this binding instrument deal with all aspects of possession, use of nuclear weapons. This has to be stated that there is illegal without any exception whatsoever. We are negotiating the legally binding instrument. It must be based on existing instruments and strengthen existing instruments. We have to take the highest standards reflected in nuclear weapon-free zone treaties such as the Tlatelolco Agreement and also the NPT and the CTBT. In other words, what we are looking for is to complement, not just repeat obligations which are already contained in those instruments, but we want to complement them. We realize today more than half of the world's people are living in countries under the threat of nuclear disaster. The devastation that would be caused would be horrendous. And so we attach the greatest priority to the provisions relating to the illegality of having nuclear weapons. Peru believes that the guiding principle should set forth specifically that nuclear weapons are illegal because of their unacceptable consequences. And this should be part of a general principle. So one, prohibit the design, production, use, acquisition, stockpiling, conservation, stationing, deployment, use, or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and the destruction of such weapons within a given time frame so as to strengthen collective security. On the question of destroying the weapons, we have to destroy nuclear weapons wherever they are in the control, ownership, or possession of a state. Also, there must be a commitment to destroy all such weapons in the states, in the territory of other states, wherever the weapons are under the control of a state, another state. Two, there must be a prohibition on funding nuclear weapons. The states parties must not in any way assist, encourage, or induce any other party to not comply with the provisions. Three, we must have appropriate protocols. Another issue we should include is verification and implementation. There should be inspection of to make sure that nuclear power is being used only for peaceful purposes. If we are able to include all of these articles, we will be stigmatizing the possession of nuclear weapons and moving towards the main goal of general and complete disarmament under effective international control and destroying nuclear weapons and verifying irreversible destruction of them. Thank you, Madam.
Le agradezco al...
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru and call now on the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Thank you, Madam President, for allowing the ICRC to take the floor again this morning. In this statement, we'd like to offer the ICRC's views on the core prohibitions and other obligations that should be part of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. As stated in the conference mandate, the primary goal of these negotiations is to establish a prohibition of nuclear weapons. In the view of the ICRC, the the prohibition established by the treaty must be clear and robust. Fulfilling this will require specific prohibitions on use and other key activities that support use. To this end, the treaty must unambiguously prohibit the use, development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, and transfer of nuclear weapons. It must also be prohibited to assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any of these activities. The listed prohibitions mirror those of Article 1 of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which we feel is a fitting model for the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. It contains essential prohibitions as well as understood terminology, which have been replicated in other international agreements and conventions prohibiting weapons, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. In the view of the ICRC, the prohibitions listed in the CWC would suffice to achieve the purposes of a nuclear weapon ban treaty. The conference mandate also provides that the prohibition of nuclear weapons is to lead towards their total elimination. Indeed, the elimination of nuclear weapons is essential to ensure that they are never again used. The treaty should therefore contain a clear commitment regarding the elimination of nuclear weapons. In particular, in addition to the prohibition on stockpiling, the treaty could contain an obligation for a state party to declare, remove from operational status, and destroy any nuclear weapons that it may possess at the time that of its adherence to the treaty. Such a commitment to eliminate nuclear weapons would allow a state that possesses nuclear weapons to join the treaty without needing to wait for the completion of its stockpile destruction. The time frame and details for the eventual elimination of a state's arsenal or nuclear arsenal and its verification could be left for discussions at a later time between the possessing state and the state parties, and this could be detailed in subsequent declarations, agreements, or protocols. The treaty should also include an obligation that each state party take the measures required at the national level to implement its obligations, including the imposition of penal sanctions to prevent and suppress violations, if these are not already in place. States must also consider how best to ensure that the needs of victims of nuclear weapon detonations are recognized and advanced, and to consider the most suitable approach to facilitate assistance and cooperation for the implementation of the treaty's obligations and to further its goals. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank the representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross for his contribution to our discussion. We've now heard the last speaker on this item for this meeting. We'll continue with the list of speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this same conference room. I would just like to take this opportunity of inviting the members of the Bureau to have a meeting now. And those regions that have not submitted nominations for the vice presidency are invited to do so as soon as possible so that we can have representation of all regions. So that's all for this meeting. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. this afternoon. This meeting stands adjourned.
Needs have not been adequately addressed. It should also include a deep concern about the growing risks of intentional, miscalculated, or accidental use of nuclear weapons and the imperative to prevent such use. The treaty must also include a recognition that nuclear weapons are abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience, and express a determination to advance towards, for states to advance towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. These principles have, under different formulations, been raised in earlier UN resolutions and reports, as well as Resolution 1 of the 2011 Council of Delegates of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement. These principles impel the sense of urgency and necessity for action to advance nuclear disarmament and the development of a prohibition treaty. The treaty should also reinforce the fact that it is part of the broader efforts to advance nuclear disarmament and the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction, a goal set out, as we've heard, in the very first resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly over 70 years ago. In this regard, it should reaffirm the importance of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and recall the commitments of Article 6 of that treaty and the action plans adopted by NPT states parties. It should also reaffirm the importance and role of the treaties creating nuclear weapon-free zones. The treaty should also set out its object and purpose. In the view of the ICRC, the object and purpose of a global prohibition on nuclear weapons include to protect humanity from the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that any use of nuclear weapons would have, to establish a prohibition at the global level, to advance towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and to help bring the area of nuclear weapons to an end once and for all time. The principles set out in this statement can be readily included in the preamble of the treaty. Its object and purpose could be part of the preamble, or they could be articulated in a specific article dedicated to that purpose. Wherever they are placed, the object and purpose, as well as the principles, represent key components of the treaty that will give it a strong foundation and influence its future application and interpretation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al distinguido.
Thank you very much to the representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have heard the last speaker in the list on this item for this meeting. So in accordance with the decision taken in February, we will now hear statements from civil society. I call on Ms. Lynette Ngayu of the African Council of Religious Leaders.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, delegates. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, wishes to make the following recommendations to the preamble. First and foremost, it must convey our deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and our determination, for the sake of all humankind, to eliminate these abhorrent, earth-destroying weapons forevermore. It should stress the need to ensure the full realization of the rights of all victims of nuclear weapons, bearing in mind the sanctity and equity of all human life. We acknowledge the disproportionate and ongoing impact of the use, testing, and development of nuclear weapons on women and girls and indigenous communities around the world.
Law, in particular international humanitarian law under all circumstances, stressing that the only absolute and effective guarantee against the use of nuclear weapons is their complete elimination. Rejecting categorically such concepts as nuclear deterrence and all national or alliance nuclear postures and strategies authorizing the use of nuclear weapons. Recalling the long-standing international demand by the world political and religious leaders, academia, parliamentarians, and civil society for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, And finally, Madam President, underlining the contribution of the treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones to the objective of a world without nuclear weapons, and the need for the establishment of such zones in volatile regions such as the Middle East. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al
I thank the distinguished representative of Iran for his statement. I call now on the representative of the International Red Cross Committee.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, delegates. The International Committee of the Red Cross has long called for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. The ICRC first appealed for the elimination of nuclear weapons in 1945 and has repeated this call ever since. In 2011, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, of which the ICRC is a part, appealed to all states to pursue in good faith and conclude with urgency and determination negotiations to prohibit the use of and completely eliminate nuclear weapons through a legally binding international agreement based on existing commitments and international obligations. The ICRC welcomes that such negotiations are now taking place through an inclusive process in the framework of the UN General Assembly. In this session, the ICRC would like to offer its views on the key elements of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that relate to its underlying principles and to its object and purpose. We offer these views for states to consider as they develop their views and proposals on the treaty's core components. The underlying principles and the object and purpose of a treaty identify the factors that have motivated states to negotiate the instrument and that aid in the subsequent interpretation of the treaty and its provisions. The ICRC believes that the underlying principles of a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons should include the following: an expression of deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and the lack of adequate humanitarian response capacity to assist the victims of nuclear weapons. It should equally incorporate a recognition that it is difficult to envisage how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with the principles and rules of international humanitarian law. In particular, the rules of distinction, or the rule of distinction, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the rules on proportionality and precautions in attack, the prohibition on the use of weapons of a nature to cause unnecessary suffering, and the rules that exist for the protection of the environment. The treaty should also include a recognition of the harm suffered by people and communities from nuclear detonations, and that in many instances their
girls and children who are at greatest risk of harm from exposure to ionizing radiation. The imperative of nuclear eradication to secure planetary health is not optional or negotiable. It is the precondition for the survival and continuation of human civilization and life on Earth. Finally, we urge that the treaty be fully comprehensive in its prohibitions. We may not have a second chance. I thank you.
Le agradezco al señor.
I'd like to thank Mr. Tilman Ruff of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War for his statement. And I call now on Ms. Jacqueline Cabasso of the Western States Legal Foundation.
I appreciate the opportunity to make a few comments on preambular elements of a prohibition treaty.
I will draw upon the discussion paper submitted and circulated by the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, or IALANA. It makes detailed arguments in support of the 3 points I will make today, and also comments on other topics you will be addressing this week. I commend the paper to your attention. First, it is imperative that the preamble include an affirmation of the illegality of use of nuclear weapons under existing law. This is essential because the core operative prohibitions will apply only to states parties. Any implication that non-states parties are not subject to a prohibition of use must be avoided. A preambular affirmation of the illegality of use would also reinforce the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. The norm of non-use arises out of a broad recognition that the use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with international humanitarian law and the practice of non-use of the weapons in war since 1945. Second, the preamble should include an affirmation of the illegality of the threat of use of nuclear weapons under the UN Charter and international humanitarian law. This would help undermine nuclear deterrence, as well as specific threats that could lead to actual employment of nuclear weapons. Delegitimizing nuclear deterrence is essential to achieving the abolition of nuclear weapons. So long as nuclear deterrence is tolerated, good faith negotiation of nuclear abolition is impossible, resulting in the permanent violation of the disarmament obligation. Third, as stated in the resolution deciding to convene this conference to negotiate a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons leading toward their total elimination, the preamble should recognize that additional measures for the irreversible and verified destruction of nuclear weapons will be needed in order to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. In particular, it should describe the Prohibition Treaty as a step toward a comprehensive agreement on nuclear disarmament, a nuclear weapons convention. Let me remind you that a model convention drafted by IALANA and colleague organizations is already a UN document. Thank you for your attention.
Le agradezco la...
I thank Ms. Jacqueline Cabasso of Western States Legal Foundation for her statement. I now call on Ms. Jean-Marie Colleen and Mr. Kasoshi, Member of Parliament, representing Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Our network for non-proliferation and disarmament is a global one involving more than 700 parliamentarians in many countries. We work with 3 states that are absent today, France, Belgium, and Monaco. We are involved in forums to support nuclear disarmament. The resolution for a resolution prohibiting nuclear weapons. We, in the European parliamentary context, welcome the 3 conferences that were held and ask all members of parliament to foster disarmament, as this is an absolute...
It should underscore the need to rehabilitate, to the greatest extent possible, environments affected by nuclear weapons. The relationship between humanity and the environment is essential and interconnected for the sustenance of our common home. It should emphasize that in a world where basic human needs have not yet been met, the vast resources allocated to the production, modernization, and maintenance of nuclear arsenals must be redirected towards human development and viable societies. It should highlight the role of public conscience in furthering the principles of humanity, as evidenced by the global call of ICANN, the Red Cross, and the world's faith communities for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It should welcome the broad support for the international norms prohibiting other indiscriminate weapons, including biological and toxin weapons, chemical weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. It should reaffirm the applicability of international humanitarian law to the use of nuclear weapons. Finally, it should reaffirm that there exists an obligation under international law to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to the total eliminations of nuclear weapons. In short, the preamble must convey our firm belief that these are wholly unacceptable and unethical weapons, given their indiscriminate nature, their inherent immorality, and their potential to cause indiscriminate harm and annihilate humanity and the planet as a whole. Thank you for your attention.
Le agradezco.
I would like to thank Ms. Gallo for that statement. I call now on Mr. Tilman Roof, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Thank you, Madam President. These negotiations grew out of the humanitarian initiative advanced by ICRC President Kellenberger's call in 2010 to the Geneva Diplomatic Corps and the subsequent recognition of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons in the consensus outcome document of the 2010 NPT Review Conference. We've been delighted to hear so many interventions refer to the substantive conclusions of the landmark evidence-based humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons conferences in Oslo, Nayarit and Vienna. The basis for these negotiations is the utterly catastrophic devastation that would inevitably be caused by any use of nuclear weapons, and while they exist, the alarming and growing daily risk of their use. We think this should be prominent in the treaty preamble. An understanding of what nuclear weapons do invalidates all arguments for continuing possession of these weapons and requires that they urgently be prohibited and eliminated as the only course of action commensurate with the existential danger they pose. The world's largest federations of doctors, nurses and public health professionals are united in this assessment, circulated as a joint working paper to this conference. We believe that the survivors of nuclear weapon impacts, civil society and international experts and organisations should participate in every forum discussing nuclear weapons before and after the conclusion of a banned treaty. We greatly welcome the productive collaborative partnerships with governments in this conference. We commend reference to human rights in the preamble. While human rights are usually considered as non-hierarchical and indivisible, the right to life is a precondition for the enjoyment of all other rights. We commend recognition of our collective responsibility to protect the life and health of future generations in a healthy biosphere and protecting the most vulnerable, particularly women and...
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, distinguished delegates. The fifth plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination is called to order. The conference will now continue its consideration of Topic 1, Principles and Objectives and Preambular Elements, under Sub-Item B of Agenda Item 8. I call now on the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, everyone. For us, the preamble should explain the foundations and raison d'etre of the instrument and the intentions of state parties. Therefore, it deserves our particular attention. It must be focused, clear, concise, and precise. We share many of the views expressed yesterday by delegations. At the same time, we want to place further emphasis on some elements that need to be included in the preamble. They are as follows. Expressing concern about the grave threat to the survival of humanity posed by the existence of nuclear weapons and by their threat or use. Expressing concern also about the lack of political will by the nuclear weapon states that resulted in the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament and prevented commencing multilateral negotiations on nuclear disarmament in the CD. Acknowledging the catastrophic humanitarian consequences and risks associated with a nuclear weapon detonation. Expressing conviction that the continued existence of nuclear weapons undermines the maintenance of international peace and security as the basic purposes of the United Nations. Reaffirming that any use of nuclear weapons would be a violation of the Charter of the United Nations and a crime against humanity as successively declared in the UNGA resolutions since 1961. Underlining the necessity and urgency of developing a comprehensive convention prohibiting the development, production, stockpiling, and trade or use of nuclear weapons, and providing for their total elimination in a time-bound manner and based on international verification mechanism. Recalling the obligations of NPT state parties under its Article 6 to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament and expressing their determination to act accordingly. Underlining the importance of the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, in which the court unanimously concluded that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. Reaffirming that any use of nuclear weapons is contrary to the very principles of international